We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Yesterday, we were reminded that last year only 17% of government departments had completed a fraud assessment. That works out to be 3 in 18 departments, according to the Auditor General's numbers. Now we find out that a year later, only one whole department has completed its fraud assessment. This is despite Executive Council agreeing that, and I quote, "Government departments and organizations should continually address weakness and risks to the province in the critical areas outlined." End of quote, and I can table that. Is the Premier satisfied that one department a year shows sufficient effort to address weaknesses and risks?
The Honourable Premier.
No.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
So I guess we would like to know what's going to be done about that, but it's, rather shocking that included among the departments without a risk assessment in the Department of Internal Services. Internal Services is responsible for much of the province's procurement. Now, we all had to complete, as we all know in this chamber, we had to complete a fraud training assessment, and we had to prove it. It's odd that the department responsible for procurement wouldn't be on top of this fraud assessment. So can the Premier explain why Internal Services hasn't completed its risk assessment?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, they're in the process of completing that.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, last spring we were given a very clear picture of how well the Department of Internal Services deals with its risks. Every Auditor General report has recommendations and responses. Last year's report was examined by the Public Accounts Committee, and it didn't seem to prompt government to be any more diligent on following its own promises. So you can see why, Mr. Speaker, we're less than enthused about the new Public Accounts Committee. So given the province's inaction on its own promise to address weaknesses and risks, why should Nova Scotians trust anything this government tells the Auditor General?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member would know, the Auditor General is independent from government, Mr. Speaker. It's the Auditor General actually who reviews what government does. It's the Auditor General who tells Nova Scotians when he sees there's weaknesses. It's up to government to respond to the request from the Auditor General. We're doing so. I would encourage the honourable member to show respect for the Auditor General and her party to do the same when the Auditor General is before the committee. Hey, Leo. I would encourage them to show respect for the independence of the Auditor General and take their opportunity they have before the Committee of PAC and ask them those very questions, Mr. Speaker. The Auditor General will be very clear to continue to say what concerns him about the direction of our government.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
According to family members quoted in a news report yesterday, which I'll table, reporting incidents of nursing home abuse in Nova Scotia is, these are their words, like talking to a wall. The source of the frustration here is the practice that complaints that don't lead to a formal investigation, and this is the majority of complaints, that these complaints do not receive any written response at all. Can the Premier explain why the government has continued the practice that there's no written follow-up to a majority of nursing home abuse complaints?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is an ongoing conversation between the complainant and the family and those who are reviewing it, Mr. Speaker. It is a verbal conversation that's happening. Some of those do end up being investigated by outside agencies, Mr. Speaker. Those ones will continue, but I also want to say to the honourable member, as he knows, there's an independent committee looking at the whole issue of long-term care, the structure of it, what are the changes that we can make to continue to ensure that we provide the supports for our loved ones and quite frankly, answer the questions that their families may have.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, but the difficulty is that administrative procedure regarding nursing home abuse complaints is not within the terms of reference of the expert panel. So I want to return to the difficulty that in order for a family whose nursing home complaint has not led to a formal investigation to be able to find out why this is so, they have to file at the moment a formal Freedom of Information request. And it's not hard to understand why people in that situation would feel that their complaint had not been respected and that something was being hidden from them. So will the Premier establish a practice in nursing homes whereby every complaint of an abusive situation in a nursing home receives a formal response and is not behind the wall of FOIPOP?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I do want to commit to him that if it is not in the what has come back from the expert panel, I will give him my word that I will look at this situation and find out why we are not writing directly to families of residents of ours and do what we can to ensure that we do that as much as possible.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
I appreciate this answer and I respect it, and I think it reflects an understanding that at some basic level something somewhere here isn't as it ought to be. And so I want to ask the Premier finally if he wouldn't agree that the present general climate of unopenness about nursing homes is contributing to a lack of public confidence in our overall healthcare system.
The Honourable Premier.
No, Mr. Speaker, I don't share the issue of the lack of confidence in the healthcare system. Mr. Speaker, there are day in and day out Nova Scotians who are accessing many parts of our healthcare system who talk to me about the great service they're receiving, whether it's in primary care, long-term care, or other aspects of delivering care. But I do want to go back to what was the genesis of his original question, that when a family is concerned about their loved one in long-term care, that the issue of a written communication back to them is an important question, one that if it is not in that report, Mr. Speaker, I will endeavour to ensure that whenever that is possible, that we will do that and correct that issue.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General noted in his fall report how the Nova Scotia Health Authority is playing fast and loose with hard-earned Nova Scotia tax dollars when it comes to hospitality for top-level officials. I raised the issue of a constituent on income assistance who had to travel 4 times by taxi at a cost of $30 each way to the Cape Breton Regional Hospital. See, Mr. Speaker, she's without a family doctor and the Northside General Emergency Room was closed. To put it into perspective, that senior executive dinner for just 5 people cost taxpayers over $300, which accounts for almost half the money she receives in income assistance. So my question to the Minister of Health is, does he believe it's okay for the NSA to spend Nova Scotia tax dollars on fancy dinners for its executive when the Nova Scotians are struggling to access the services they deserve?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for the question. Indeed, the Auditor General identified some concerns with hospitality events and in some areas, he recognized that there needed to be improved controls and policies around when and how these types of events take place. The executive within the Health Authority took those recommendations seriously. They've updated their policies, Mr. Speaker, and I believe they brought them to the board at their last meeting earlier this month, and those policies have been updated and approved.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, the government likes to pat itself on the back and roars from the high heavens at how they are the most accountable government the province has ever seen. But, Mr. Speaker, talk is cheap. I'll remind the minister, we have over 100,000 Nova Scotians without a family doctor. We have ambulances parked 14 deep at Nova Scotia emergency departments. We have emergency rooms closed completely. It's great the NSHA has updated their policies after the AG highlighted the close to $10,000 he spent on hospitality. But it's not good enough, and Nova Scotians deserve better. So my question is, the minister, how can the minister sleep at night knowing that while his department is responsible for lavish soirees, Nova Scotians from across the province are being denied the health care they deserve?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member would know, we as a government have been working with our partners at the health authorities, both at the Nova Scotia Health Authority and the IWK. We've worked with our partners in Doctors Nova Scotia to listen to what their concerns and priorities were on behalf of their members, what we could do to improve recruitment and retention. One of the main areas that they focused on in the last year, Mr. Speaker, has been around compensation. We entered into an agreement to change the compensation model for an area that Nova Scotians share, which is the area of primary care, Mr. Speaker. How to get comprehensive primary care as well as increase attachment rates of Nova Scotians to primary care providers. We invested almost $40 million, Mr. Speaker, to move those initiatives forward.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Environment. Next week, we'll find out if the minister is going to approve tire burning in Nova Scotia. It will be a good opportunity for Nova Scotians to judge whether the environment really is the minister's primary concern, as she often repeats. Mr. Speaker, this project is being sold as green because it will reduce emissions at the Lafarge plant. But as experts point out, the project will also increase greenhouse gas emissions overall in aggregate mining. The minister assures us that all her decisions are based on science, so I just want to ask, before the minister makes her decision, will she be calculating the overall impact on provincial greenhouse gas emissions?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, and thank the honourable member for that question. As she's noted, my first concern is the environment of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, Lafarge does have an environmental assessment approval for one-year pilot to test the program. There will be coming forward in the next days their approval for an industrial approval. The decision will be made by December 9th.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've asked the minister before when it comes to glyphosate spraying if she can make the decision, and she says her staff makes these decisions. So if the minister is going to actually approve this project, the public's money will be subsidizing Lafarge. Nova Scotians will be paying for the burning, not for tire recycling. And recyclers have told us that if these tires were not being burned, they could be recycled. Recycling means they store their carbon and toxins instead of releasing them into the atmosphere. Recycling means that tires can replace other non-recycled products in ways that reduce overall emissions. So, Mr. Speaker, burning is not recycling. So I have a very, very basic question for the minister. Can she simply agree that recycling tires is better for the environment than burning them?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll thank the member for that question as well. You know, whenever there's an environmental assessment done, that means exactly that. There's an extensive scientific information, everything science and evidence-based, to show what the effects will be on the environment. The decision has not yet been made on industrial approval. That will be made again by October 9th.
The honourable member for Inverness.
For the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, in previous sessions, my colleagues have asked questions on the new driver's license cards for Nova Scotians. The cards are produced in Ontario, which has led to some additional turnaround time, and they're supposed to have features that enhance security. But according to a lecture given by a senior investigator at the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner, the photos taken for these cards are being compiled into a facial recognition database. Are these photos being kept in a facial recognition database?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for the question. That's certainly part of the new identification cards, driver's license, are around facial recognition to beef up security. I don't know if there's a facial recognition database or if there's any component of that that's being compiled anywhere, but I'd be happy to get that answer for the House and for the member. Thanks.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the province is getting a better product for less money, is there a catch? According to that same lecture, the current privacy legislation in Nova Scotia doesn't set any rules around what can be done with this data. It doesn't stop it from being shared or sold. What safeguards are in place to ensure that this facial recognition database will be used for driver's licenses and driver's licenses only?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for the question. I would note for the House, this is a procurement that was done with the Atlantic provinces, so it certainly isn't just Nova Scotia. It's our sister provinces as well that entered into this procurement. Again, from a security perspective, obviously they'll be upheld the standards that are required to the highest level of security. Clearly, we have no vested interest in collecting the facial identities or facial recognition information on any Nova Scotian or any citizen. We're doing this for good reasons, for good purposes. We want to protect the security of our citizens, Mr. Speaker, not jeopardize it. Thanks.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Justice. Last week, the Ontario government reassured future government-run cannabis stores that their customers and their privacy is top priority, and I'll table that story. Like Nova Scotians, Ontarians have expressed concerns that their personal data will be stored in the United States or be vulnerable to be hacked. In 2018, Cannabis report by Deloitte ranked privacy and data security among the top demands of Canadian cannabis consumers. Ontario, though, has guaranteed any data collected at Ontario cannabis stores that it will be only stored in Ontario. Can the minister make the same guarantee here in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation continues to develop their platform, Mr. Speaker. My understanding, if there is any data retained, it will all be stored within Canada.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are all too familiar with this prospect of our personal information being hacked, as we've witnessed in the last year. Cannabis will be legal in just 14 days. And Ontario and other provinces have been very clear that online buyers will not be required to create an online account profile. Ontario buyers specifically will be required to show identification when the order is delivered, but no copy will be made. Ontario consumers know that all information will be deleted after a very short period of time. So with the legalization such a short time away and this government's spotty history with personal information, why hasn't the minister made the same kind of assurances that Ontario government has for users in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague would know from past discussions, both in this House and outside this House, that we have taken our time to ensure that the foundation of this legislation is grounded in good public policy and advice from those who had past experience in the retail of cannabis. I want to assure my colleague that with the delivery of this service, the online platform, number one, we will respect the rights of those individuals who consume and purchase through online. But, Mr. Speaker, as I indicated in my first response, any of the data, if there is data retained, would be stored within Canada.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the minister responsible for the Nova Scotia Gaming Commission. On Monday, we learned that the NSGC Corporation paid witnesses to appear before Law Amendments Committee to support a proposed changes to the voluntary self-exclusion program. In response to questions yesterday, both the Premier and the Minister made it clear that they were not in support of the decision and that the NSGC should find the cost for those witnesses within their own operations. Mr. Speaker, I accept that the Minister and the Premier agree that this is wrong, but the remedy here seems somewhat incomplete. Every dollar of profit that the NSGC makes is turned over to general revenues of the province. The money has been spent and will not be flowing back to the province. Does the Minister agree that this is just a question of moving money around and that Nova Scotians will never see these dollars? And can she tell me how this is not a shell game?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the member indicated, both the Premier and I responded yesterday to say that the practice of bringing expert witnesses into the law amendments. It was an honourable decision. I commend the Gaming Corp for bringing those folks here. We do not support that their expenses were paid, and we've indicated that both of us yesterday and to the media. And in fact, I did indicate to the media and all others that I had directed my deputy to work with those at the Gaming Corp to ensure that any of those dollars came out of their operating budget, not out of revenue that would come back to the province.
The honourable member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I certainly wouldn't use the words honourable decision when talking about this, but if I can continue, I'm curious to know, according to the business plan of the NSGC for 2018 and 19, the only expenses that are actually listed there are responsible gambling programs and commitments to community programs. In order to cover these costs within their budget, which the minister has stated, something is going to have to be cut. How will the minister ensure that the responsible gambling initiatives and the community programs that are listed will not be affected by the requirement for the NSGC to find the costs for the witnesses within their own budget?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said here many times on the floor of the House, that one of the things that we want to make sure, and we take every step to ensure, that there are programs available for those who may be experiencing some challenges within their own playing practices, within their own gaming practices. We will continue to make sure that those programs are funded, and none of those expenses that we're talking about yesterday will come out of any community program.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. The Halifax Sexual Health Centre depends on physician contributions to help keep the clinic running. The departure of 5 family doctors from the centre has created a funding shortfall. Tests for blood-borne infections like HIV, syphilis, and Hep C and B are now offered just 1 day a week instead of 3, and the centre's executive director says they'll only be able to offer testing to 1/3 of the regular clients this year. Mr. Speaker, what is the minister doing to ensure that Nova Scotians can get the preventative sexual health care that they need?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member raising the question. As I understand it, the circumstances, as the member noted, at this clinic site have changed throughout the year this year. That's a situation that they've recently brought forward in their discussions within the Health Authority and the department. But indeed, I'd like to advise the member that we do support this clinic over $100,000 per year. In addition, as part of our broader commitment to agencies in this area, we do provide a pool of funding as well that supports other clinics, including this one and some others. So we do invest to provide supports in this area across the province.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, sexually transmitted infections are ramping up in Nova Scotia. Confirmed cases of HIV doubled this summer, and the rates for gonorrhea are on track to be the highest they've been in 5 years. Anonymous testing provided by the Halifax Sexual Health Clinic helps to keep infection rates down, but the funding crunch the clinic faces could undermine that preventative work. Mr. Speaker, will the minister commit to provide the Halifax Sexual Health Centre with the funding it needs to get this testing back on track?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. You know, as the member noted, there are some data coming in that shows that there are some shifts in behaviours and blood-borne and sexually transmitted infections that are growing not just in this province but in other jurisdictions. The member referenced specifically HIV, so I am pleased that earlier this year we moved forward to introduce the PrEP treatment, Mr. Speaker, as part of our programming. So again, Mr. Speaker, we're taking the concerns in this area very seriously, and we're continuing our investments.
The honourable member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. Income assistance recipients at times receive a letter via mail indicating any decisions made on their case. A notice of ineligibility, for example. The letter also informs the recipient of their right to appeal said decision within 30 days of the recipient getting the letter. Caseworkers have no way of knowing when a recipient received the letter in the post and therefore goes by the date that the letter was written. Since the letter is mailed, this reduces the actual appeal period the recipient has. So will the minister look at removing the ambiguity of the various notices of decisions by implementing the need to clarify, to clearly state the actual appeals decision deadline date, which also considers the transition period for the letter to be sent by mail?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. We do not only send out letters, we also do try to reach out by phone, Mr. Speaker. So I do want to be clear that that if the honourable member has any cases that he has dealt with in recent times where someone has not had the opportunity to appeal in a timely manner, he can always bring that to our department and we can look at that. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colchester Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you very much. The same letter also informs recipients of a pamphlet called How to Appeal Decisions About Assistance. These pamphlets are noted to be available in the local offices. If recipients choose to make appeals but are unfamiliar with the process, they either have to figure out how to get it physically or request a pamphlet to be mailed to them. Both these options take time. So would the minister look at eliminating this potential barrier to appeal by ensuring that the How to Appeal Decisions About Assistance information pamphlet be always mailed with the letter of the notice?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
That is indeed a good suggestion. I'll be happy to look into it for the member.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Environment. We all know that the deadline is looming to cease using Boat Harbour for Northern Pulp's effluent. It's less than 16 months away, which means in 16 months, constituents in Pictou County will be expecting the project to start. The cleanup requires a Class 2 environmental assessment, which itself requires 275 days, which is more than half of the days left before the deadline. Can the minister confirm whether an application has been received to begin the Class 2 assessment of the Boat Harbour cleanup?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the honourable member for that question. No, I can't confirm. I don't believe that it has been received at this point.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Don't believe. It's troubling, Mr. Speaker. It's troubling because this is probably our biggest environmental mess in Nova Scotia right now. The cleanup from the effluent requires a Class 2 assessment. That is because there's so many chemicals such as dioxins, mercury, furans, etc., etc. But the new process that's supposed to remove all these chemicals only requires a Class 1. Now, I know there is a lot of wording around what is a new project and what is a modification to an existing project. So my question is, if cleaning up the effluent is a Class 2, then how can cleaning the effluent be only considered a Class 1?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, as the honourable member pointed out, there is a discrepancy between Class 2 and Class 1. Very clear with Boat Harbour, with the effluent plant, that it would be Class 1. These are actually water treatment plants, which is something that's done in many municipalities in different ways. Even though it's treating the effluent, it still would fall under the Class 1. You know, I can't say enough about the Boat Harbour cleanup. I actually stood on the harbors, on the shores of Boat Harbour with Chief Andrea Paul and witnessed the tragedy that has happened there. So all of us in government are very concerned about Harbour, about the cleanup, and we're looking forward to seeing that all cleaned up. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is also for the Minister of the Environment. I share the Minister's concern and excitement over the cleanup of Boat Harbour. I wish the Minister would share our concern over the treatment of the new effluent. It's well within the Minister's power The minister chooses to hide behind words. The treatment of the cleanup is a Class 2, but the assessment for the new effluent treatment plant is only a Class 1. Class 2 after the fact and Class 1 before. It doesn't make sense to me, Mr. Speaker, and I think we need to understand that when this House resumes, it'll be less than a year away. And when we come back in the spring, this will all be less than a year away. The minister doesn't believe an application has been received for the Boat Harbour cleanup. I'd like to ask the minister, does she know if an application has been yet to be received for the new effluent treatment plant?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the opposition member says, you know, the application now has not yet come in. We have not received an application yet from Northern Pulp for the treatment plant or for the environmental assessment.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Mr. Speaker, no application yet for the cleanup of Boat Harbour. No application yet for the new treatment effluent plant. Time is ticking. We've seen how this government performs when they go to execute on major projects. We don't have to think very long back to the rollout of the pre-primary. We don't have to think very far back to the way this government handled the FOIPOP breach. Sloppy, sloppy, sloppy. Mr. Speaker, there's no room for sloppiness with the Northumberland Strait. There's no room for sloppiness with the new effluent treatment plant. I'd like to ask, does the minister have any contingency plan if the new effluent treatment plant is not ready by the self-imposed date of this government?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I kind of have to wonder at the comments coming from the minister, from the member opposite. You know, we can't proceed with an environmental assessment till we have an application. Now, maybe in another government and another day, they would choose to do that. But this government's going to wait until they.
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
He doesn't like to follow process.
My department will wait until they receive the application before we make a determination, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Municipal Affairs. Rural municipalities are on the front lines of challenges facing Nova Scotia, from more severe storms and rising sea levels to aging infrastructure and depopulation. Meeting these challenges takes resources, and the cost of services municipalities provide keeps growing. But the transfers municipalities receive from the province have not increased, and the province continues to take $1 out of every 5 of property tax that municipalities collect, forcing municipalities to make difficult decisions that they shouldn't have to make. So my question for the minister is, when can municipalities expect to see more resources from the province?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And this comes back to something we've heard a lot about in the House over the last year, at least since spring anyway, around the equalization formula that currently exists. We're committed to reviewing that along with our municipal partners and seeing whether or not there'll be a new formula, Mr. Speaker, that may indeed put more funds into some of those more rural municipalities that are indeed experiencing some of these challenges. And Mr. Speaker, we're also working on something called municipal modernization, where we're having regional cooperation to also help offset some of the costs as we move forward and work together and partner where we can to meet some of the challenges that lie before us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, we have indeed been hearing about equalization and about municipal modernization, but I'm wondering in which modern era we are actually going to see the rubber hit the road here. The Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities has described the situation municipal leaders are facing in Nova Scotia as managing decline. The economic indicators that the Premier is so proud of don't speak to the experience in much of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, municipalities are frustrated that this government has no clear regional vision for economic development, and instead they're left to compete against each other for investment and development dollars. So when will municipalities have a new framework to collaborate and share resources instead of competing?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I guess Perhaps the honourable member has missed earlier this week, we had law amendments around Windsor and West Hants as an example. Two municipalities in this province are moving forward together in a positive way, which will grow economic development, Mr. Speaker, in this province, and we've got others lined up that are interested in talking about the same thing, Mr. Speaker. With regards to other money that's going in and other funds, each and every municipality has the opportunity to receive grants, which we put a lot of those out in a variety of different forms, Mr. Speaker. All of that information is public and available online, should the honourable member choose to have a look. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Question for the Minister of Justice. Convicted pedophile Fenwick McIntosh is back in Canada. It was not clear whether Nepal released McIntosh or if he was being transferred under the Transfer of Offenders Act. Mr. Speaker, did our government fly him home? Where is he now? Will Canada require him to serve the remainder of his sentence, or is he a free man in Canada as he's always been?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The individual that my colleague has referred to has been released by a nation, Mr. Speaker, consistent with international requirements. We respect those requirements, Mr. Speaker. I don't know where this individual is at the present time.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, that doesn't give me a lot of confidence, nor the people who have suffered at that man's hands. Mr. Speaker, there will be young boys at risk wherever McIntosh decides to live. That's what happened in Nepal. After 17 years of delays in our justice system, passport errors and other mistakes, the court process in Nova Scotia deemed that McIntosh would have a low risk to reoffend. Then he proved once again that he's a serial pedophile. Why does the government continue to fumble justice for Fenwick McIntosh and the tens and possibly hundreds of boys he has sexually assaulted over his lifetime?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague would know, Mr. Speaker, that the province of Nova Scotia and this nation had nothing to do with the release of Mr. McIntosh from the country where he was detained. I have full confidence, Mr. Speaker, in our law enforcement community and the intelligence community of Interpol. I'm confident, Mr. Speaker, that the work they do and the interest they have, specifically within our province, will continue to provide the protection to Nova Scotians that we would expect them to.
The honourable member for Cumberland South.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Business. I rise today in a matter of great concern for many residents in Spring Hill. We have recently learned that Laurentide Paint Recycling will be moving its operations from Spring Hill to New Brunswick. This will ultimately end in 16 jobs in a small town lost or moved to the New Brunswick area. This kind of uncertainty is destabilizing to everyone, and many are looking to the province for assistance. Is the minister aware of these pending job losses at Laurentide, and what might this department be able to do to support the economy in this area?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. In fact, the member did bring this to my attention, and he did talk about the concern not only for the specific 16 individuals, their families, and those in indirect jobs that would be connected to this operation, but obviously for the stability of the region. Mr. Speaker, the sad reality with the private sector is sometimes we have the fortunate opportunities where we gain jobs and gain enterprise, and then the unfortunate sad times where we lose them, Mr. Speaker, for a number of reasons. So to the member, if there's anything we can do from a department perspective, if he would like me to meet with the officials and the company to see if there's anything we can do from our tools inside of NSBI or the Department of Business, I'd certainly be happy to do so.
The honourable member for Cumberland South.
I thank the minister for that response, and it leads into my next question. 16 jobs seem not like a lot for the whole province, but for this small town it's significant. A once proud mining town struggling now to find long-term industry. The residents are still proud, but wary as the community starts to disparate. If an agreeable time can be met, obviously we would like to invite you to come to Spring Hill and sit down and meet with this business. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to the member's point about 16 jobs and being one business, that's what the economy is built on now. It's no longer that large-scale operation. It's 16 jobs at a time, Mr. Speaker, and it's the spin-offs that come with that, and again, the enterprise, the entrepreneurship, and the innovation that comes from operations of that size. So I'd certainly be happy to work with the member on a time. We can have that meeting sooner than later. Thanks.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, people in the Lordways area in my constituency have been patiently waiting for improvements to the Chapel Cove Road. This road, like so many in Cape Breton, has been unsightly and dangerous to motorists for many, many years. And now, despite some improvements from the department, collapsed and blocked culverts are not being replaced in the process of new ditching. It doesn't take an engineer, Mr. Speaker, to know that a new ditch is only as good if it has the water has somewhere to go. Constituents are now worried as well about well damage and related problems from the water flow. Can the minister explain how his department can pave and ditch but forget to write into the scope of the project to replace ancient, and I know the minister loves that word, ancient collapsed culverts?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. We'll undertake to look into that situation and see if that can be repaired. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, it concerns me and those in Lordways that maintenance work on the Chapel Cove Road could end up costing everyone more in the long run because of cutting corners. It also causes me to wonder whether other local maintenance, like, say, the Lennox Passage Bridge, repairs promised by next summer could have similar issues. I'm sure the minister will agree that a job worth doing is worth doing correctly, not to mention on budget. What confidence does the minister have that the same corners cut on Chapel Cove Road won't be cut on the Lennox Passage Bridge?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud to rise today and compliment the over 2,200 workers that we have across the province who do an exemplary job, an absolutely exemplary job of dispersing and dispatching the budgets that we give them to get the job done. They do a fabulous job. Their heart is in what they do. They're trying to do at all times the best job that they can, and particularly the workers that are in the area that the member represents. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. The department has made changes to allow income assistance recipients to keep more of what they earn if they work. Those who are fortunate enough to have long-term employment are eligible for EI. If they're laid off and receive benefits they've paid into, this money is clawed back at 100%. Mr. Speaker, will the minister change the policy to treat EI benefits the same as employment earnings?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
The honourable member for the question. This gives me an opportunity to talk about some of the changes that we've made at Community Services in recent months, including, but not limited to, the changes to the wage exemption, Mr. Speaker. What that does, Mr. Speaker, is allow people to keep more of the money they earn. The amount that your income assistance is reduced is at a lower rate, Mr. Speaker. I have not looked into this particular issue at this time, but I would be happy to take a look. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I know I would be very pleased if the minister would take a look and get back to us as soon as possible, because there's many people that change could affect in a positive way, especially given that their rates are so low in general. Mr. Speaker, some ESIA recipients may also be eligible for severance payments when they lose their jobs. This type of payment is meant to compensate for weeks or months of lost work. The department deducts these amounts from IA payments. Mr. Speaker, will the minister change the policy to allow IA recipients to spread out their severance payments over the weeks and months the payment is meant to compensate for?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
As the honourable member would know, we have in fact doubled the amount of allowable assets in recent years so that people can keep more of that kind of money, as she references. And again, I'm happy to look into this EI question for her.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this week the Auditor General's financial report cast some caution on this government's plan for rural internet development. In the chapter on financial audit work results, AG Michael Pickup highlighted $238 million allocated to the Nova Scotia Internet Funding Trust over the past 2 fiscal years. The AG notes that trusts are not reported in provincial financial statements. I will table that document, Mr. Speaker. Surely any reasonable government would want to make sure all those trust dollars are accountable to taxpayers. My question for the minister, with this sizable piece of infrastructure placed in an independent trust, will it report any administrative or compensation expenses to Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the member for the question. We certainly want to abide by all the recommendations and the suggestions from the Auditor General, Mr. Speaker. I think we've made that very clear this week with respect to our direction on public accounts. I think that with the Internet Trust, the purpose of that structure is exactly for that reason. I do have a meeting upcoming with the Auditor General, and I'll be happy to bring that forward. We're going to fully disclose every single dollar that's spent under the Internet Trust.
The honourable member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for that response. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians from one end of this province to the other deserve reliable, high-speed internet. But it needs a process by which it is rolled out to be transparent. The process this government has decided upon: expand a Crown corporation to administer money from an off-book trust through private sector partners. That's an awful lot of layers, Mr. Speaker, and it's an awful lot of money that any reasonable government would want to expose to some sunlight. Will the minister arrange for the Auditor General to conduct regular performance and financial audits of the Nova Scotia Internet Funding Trust?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. We're about to embark on an injection of funds for broadband, $193 million, unprecedented for any province or territory in this country, Mr. Speaker. We want to establish and provide all the sunlight that we can on these expenditures to make sure that not only we're getting it right, we're maximizing every dollar and we're providing internet service to all Nova Scotians. So yes, we will.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In July of 2015, the government released a review of the 2006 Continuing Care Strategy. And one of the last sentences of the review said, quote, "These findings, together with the continued engagement of key stakeholders, will then inform the development of our 5-year continuing care strategy set for release in 2017. Well, Mr. Speaker, 2017 has come and gone, but we've yet to see a new continuing care strategy. And we all know that Nova Scotia has one of the oldest populations in the country. In the next 5 years, it is estimated that 22% of our population will be over the age of 65. So it's not time to drag our feet on continuing care planning. So my question to the Minister of Health is, will the minister admit that he is letting seniors and their families down by promising a continuing care strategy that he has failed to deliver?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, indeed, we've done anything but drag our feet. Mr. Speaker, we've listened to Nova Scotians. We've recognized that many Nova Scotians wanting to stay at home, but recognizing that they could, as long as they can, but recognizing that they could only stay there if they had the appropriate supports in place. That's why we've increased investments over the last number of years in our home care support programs to provide those opportunities, Mr. Speaker. Beyond that, Mr. Speaker, we recognize that within our long-term care population and services that there are concerns about quality of care, and we're looking to a panel of experts to provide us with recommendations on how we can further improve the delivery of those services to residents of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I still can't believe how many questions we got answered and asked today if we don't ask questions to the Minister of Health. It's painfully obvious that this government doesn't have a plan for continuing care. All too frequently, ambulances are lined up at regional hospitals because there are no beds. Many of those beds are occupied by Nova Scotians waiting for placement in long-term care facility. This government's inaction is causing a problem that impacts, of course, the whole system. Will the minister commit today to delivering a continuing care strategy before the end of this session?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, I'm pleased to report to the House, Mr. Speaker, and the member opposite who raised the question, that in fact what we have seen under this government's leadership is a reduction in the number of people in our hospital system waiting to access long-term care, Mr. Speaker. We've seen a reduction not just of the number of people waiting in their hospitals to access long-term care, but those who are waiting in our hospitals to access long-term care, Mr. Speaker, are waiting for shorter periods of time. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Minister Delory, will you please attend the meeting?
Order, please. I'd like to remind the honourable member not to refer to members opposite by their proper name. The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Will the Honourable Minister please attend the meeting on October 14th in New Waterford? I sincerely plead with you to come.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member would know, the concerns being raised by her community, we're certainly well aware of. The member has brought them to the floor of the legislature, as well as our colleague in North Side Westmount. Mr. Speaker, we understand the concerns of the people in the communities of Cape Breton, but I assure the member that we have as our first priority the care and the health care needs of their community and their citizens, Mr. Speaker, indeed for all of Cape Breton. That's why we're investing in new primary health care centres, Mr. Speaker. We're expanding our long-term care services. We're expanding our emergency room services, Mr. Speaker. So we're doing all of these things on behalf of those residents.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, and finally, I will ask, will the honourable member please attend the meeting and listen to the concerns of the constituents in Cape Breton Centre and Cape Breton?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, in terms of, as we announced back in June, when we advised the communities and all Nova Scotians what the plans are for moving forward, the investment in new infrastructure, we identified that the next stage, Mr. Speaker, which has begun, is the functional planning. We have representatives out there, Mr. Speaker, engaging with frontline healthcare workers to identify exactly how these investments are best distributed to achieve the care needed in these communities.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now